Hello! Welcome back to my channel. I'm Kaye Spivey, and today we're going to talk about something that I've always been very passionate about since the first time I read it in 5th grade, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I was actually fortunate enough when I went to England to study abroad in 2011. I was fortunate enough to visit the Bronte Museum in Haworth and get a look at their life. There's our friend the horse. And there's the Bronte Museum. Some nice ladies. Obviously, I have also read Jane Eyre. I read it when I was much older. When I read it, it was precisely the book I needed to be reading at that time. There can't be enough hype about Jane Eyre. It's a great book. However, there's too much discussion about Wuthering Heights, and most of it isn't good things, which blows my mind. And I feel like a lot of it, unfortunately, comes from the fact that for some reason people seem to think it's a romance. And I very strongly feel that if you believe that Wuthering Heights is a romance story, you've not read Wuthering Heights. Did I say that this was going to be full of spoilers? Pretty much just spoiling it, and then I'm going to tell you what's so amazing about the book itself. We start off with neither Cathy nor Heathcliff, but Mr. Lockwood, who is our narrator. He is looking to buy the Grange, which at the moment is under Mr. Heathcliff's management. The beginning of the story is heavily narrative. Mr. Lockwood's first impressions of the moors, Wuthering Heights, Grange, Mr. Heathcliff, whom he finds very frightening. He also meets a Cathy. It is not Catherine Earnshaw he meets, but Catherine Linton, Cathy's daughter. So he's staying at the Grange and falls ill. Mr. Lockwood is giving us his first-hand account, so we were receiving it second-hand. His account of Mr. Heathcliff, who he finds kind of frightening, and his account of Catherine Linton. And those are the first impressions we get of both of them. He falls ill, and the housekeeper, Nellie, tells him the story, which is the story of Wuthering Heights. She is our real narrator of plot in the story. However, she's giving her first-hand account to Mr. Lockwood, who's giving it to us as a second-hand account, and we're receiving it third-hand. The main story of Wuthering Heights is given to us as a third-hand account. So everything that we learn about, especially Cathy Earnshaw, is watered down through Nellie's gaze. And Nellie does not like Catherine. She makes it very clear that Cathy is not someone she ever really liked. And she also has a very negative opinion of Heathcliff. And part of it has to do with the fact that she often was on the side of Cathy's older brother Hindley, who hated Heathcliff. And Heathcliff eventually drove Hindley to madness, as he did many characters. Starting off, we're getting these multiple layered narratives. Nellie tells the story about Heathcliff growing up, but at the same time Cathy growing up. He tells about Cathy's father bringing Heathcliff home. Strong implication that he's a bastard child of Mr. Earnshaw. Hindley immediately hates him. Cathy doesn't like him at first, but eventually Cathy makes him her little playmate. And they grow up, and eventually, plot and madness, not any romance, mostly people being mean to each other. There's a lot of people being mean. There are very strong influences between Cathy and Heathcliff, and Nellie doesn't approve of it, and so it sounds even twice as bad as it is. They're constantly mean to each other, but they also have a little pact, and they'd rather be the two of them and mean to everyone else, until Cathy ends up staying with the Lintons for plot reasons. And they're a different type of person. Cathy and Heathcliff are very wild children. They run all around, sneak into other people's yards and get attacked by their dogs. But the Lintons are proper little children, and they put her in a nice dress and pamper and baby her, which Cathy loves. Kathy loves being the princess and eventually ends up marrying Edgar Linton, which breaks Heathcliff's heart. He hears her talking to Nellie about it, and again, Nellie is shading every single moment we see. And so she has Kathy spill her heart to her, and she sits by quietly, knowing Heathcliff is listening in, and then tells Kathy that he's running away. In every scene, Nellie is both the protagonist and the antagonist. She tells the story as herself moving the plot forward. She got told everything by Kathy, and Kathy then scared away Heathcliff. He ran off, and then because of that married Edgar Linton and went to stay at the Grange. Nellie goes with her, continues to hate her. Years and years later, Heathcliff comes back, because now he's a proper gentleman, he's gone off and been a soldier, and because he and Kathy have a little pact of being kind of shits together, they both try and antagonize Edgar, to the point where Heathcliff's ready to fight him, and finally Kathy is like, nah, I provoked you, but don't. Heathcliff gets mad because Kathy continues to choose Edgar over him, and she revels in the attention, loves every moment of it. In fact, loves it so much, she decides she's gonna stop eating and die. Some of the best lines in the entire story are from that moment, so give me 1 second here. So this is, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of the book, is when Kathy is throwing a temper tantrum. So she wants Nellie to throw open the window, and Nellie says that she won't, because I won't give you your death of cold, I answered. You won't give me a chance of life, you mean, she said sullenly. However, I am not helpless yet. I'll open it myself. And she opens the window, and she says, Look, she cried eagerly, that's my room with the candle in it, and the trees swaying before it, and the other candle is in Joseph's garret, and Joseph sits up late, doesn't he? He's waiting till I come home that he may lock the gate. Well, he'll have to wait a while yet. It's a rough journey and a sad heart to travel it, and we must pass by Grimmerton Kick to go that journey. We've braved its ghosts often together, and dared each other to stand among the graves and ask them to come. But Heathcliff, if I dare you now, will you venture? If you do, I'll keep you. I'll not lie there by myself. They may bury me 12 feet deep and throw the church down over me, but I won't rest until you're with me. I never will. She paused and resumed with a strange smile. He's considering. He'd rather I come to him. Find a way then, not through that kirkyard. You are slow. Be content. You always followed me. And Edgar's sick of her shit and doesn't try and stop her, goes and shuts himself in his study, which is his way, and he is always shutting himself in his study. He won't stand up to Heathcliff, he's afraid of him. However, Kathy knows Heathcliff, and he comes running back, doesn't want her to die, doesn't want to be without her, and she loves it. Kathy decides that what would hurt Heathcliff most is her death. And so you need to look at Wuthering Heights like a ghost story, because from the very beginning, from the first time that Mr. Lockwood meets Heathcliff, he is haunted by Kathy's ghost. And Nellie tells the story of Kathy bringing the ghost to life for us. And everything Heathcliff does at any given moment is either an attempt to spite Kathy or an attempt to win her back. And he fluctuates between the two because she does the same to him. She'll spite him one moment and try and win his affection the next. And that's their constant dynamic. It's not a healthy dynamic, it's not a romantic dynamic. And I don't think it's intended to be. I think it's intended to be a basis for this ghost story. So something that ties throughout the plots is this idea of Kathy and Heathcliff's souls being the same soul, or their souls being in each other's body. Kathy's deciding whether or not she will marry Edgar. One of the things she says about Heathcliff is, whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. And then after Kathy dies, Nellie finds Heathcliff waiting outside, and she tells him he's died, but he already knows. And one of the things Nellie says is her senses never returned. She recognized nobody from the time you left her. She lies with a sweet smile on her face, and the latest ideas wandered back to pleasant early days. Her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly in the other world. Again, Nellie painting herself in this very kindly light, and Heathcliff says, the most quoted quote, "May she wake in torment. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe, I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul." Which is one of the most misquoted quotes from all of Wuthering Heights. But if you look at it in the way that Cathy's soul is in Heathcliff's body and Heathcliff's soul is in Cathy's body, Heathcliff is a little bit conniving, especially in his marriage to Isabel Linton, which again is another plot point in the story. He's a little bit evil, but once Cathy dies, Heathcliff goes off the deep end. He had let Isabel leave him once his spiting was done. And also, when Heathcliff was not around, Cathy was fairly sweet, fairly kind. It's an uneventful time in their lives after Heathcliff leaves and Cathy marries Edgar Linton. She's fairly calm. And if you think about that as Heathcliff's soul inhabiting her, without the two of them together to butt heads, she's a fairly normal, pleasant person living out her life. As soon as he came back, she became the monster again. That her soul coming close to her body is the idea here. And then once she has died with Heathcliff's soul, all the goodness now is gone. And only the anger and the frustration and the loneliness. And Heathcliff digs up her body twice. This is not a romance. Stop thinking of it that way. Nellie does not think of it that way. When she tells the story, it is a haunting, it is a ghost story, it is a cautionary tale about these two crazy people who weren't really in love with each other. At no point does she talk about them as lovers. It's much more often as friends, as soulmates. And they ruin everyone around them. When Cathy dies, she leaves a child. And that child is also named Cathy. And father dotes on her, loves her, Nellie loves her, she's little sunshine at the Grange. She looks like Linton. One of the things I have a problem with very often when they make Wuthering Heights movies is they'll use the same actress to play older Cathy and younger Cathy. And that's great and all, but one of the big plot points of the book is that younger Cathy does not look like older Cathy. Hello! Welcome back to my channel. He did not help himself to love her. And we know this because Cathy's brother Hindley has a son named Hareton. And Hareton is the splitting resemblance of Cathy. And Heathcliff mentions it more than once. He hates Hindley so greatly that he won't educate Hareton, even once he sort of becomes the guardian of him. He doesn't treat him fantastically, but he can't help but love him, and it's a bit creepy, little pedophilic, but he talks about how the way in which he would love Hareton if it was not Hindley's son, that he's the one who looks exactly like Cathy, and her daughter does not. And a lot of that, the fact that younger Cathy looks like her father, is another reason that Heathcliff finds to mistreat her, because he hates Edgar Linton. He ends up essentially legally kidnapping younger Cathy by coercing her into marrying her cousin, his son, and this all gets very complicated, but while she's there, his son is dying. Once he does die, Heathcliff now owns what his daughter-in-law owned, because that's the contract he had her sign. He's an excellent businessman, to be perfectly honest. Horrible, horrible person, but he ends up with 2 properties when he was born in the streets. And he keeps Cathy there, and she is miserable, and Nellie lives at the Grange and doesn't really know what's happening. And it is around this time that Mr. Lockwood comes into the story. And so we start to match narratives slowly. Younger Kathy is so upset, and that's what we saw initially. Because Nellie has now told us up to this story, this is her little sunshine child. She loves younger Kathy. And we start to see the goodness in the younger Kathy. Nellie eventually goes back to live with them, and younger Kathy is falling in love with Hareton. She's started teaching him, and she has started telling him that the things that Heathcliff has hidden from him. For example, his name is on the door. Hareton is the rightful owner of Wuthering Heights, which he didn't know. And we start to find the romance there, in the very end, that these horrible people, Kathy and Heathcliff, who were never lovers, who were really a kind of... You know the stories about battling gods, where there's a light side and a dark side and they're constantly in conflict? That's Kathy and Heathcliff. And it's not very clear who's good, who's bad. It's not really that kind of dichotomy. They're just always in conflict with each other. They always have to be butting heads. They always have to be hurting each other in some way. And that's the way that the two of them showed their love. With Kathy II and Hareton, it's gentleness and kindness and protecting each other from Heathcliff. That's how they show their love. And it's sort of a retribution. And the story ends when the last remaining characters from the beginning of the book, from the beginning of Nellie's story, are Nellie herself and another servant, Joseph. He's still alive. He lives through everything. But Nellie is then the arc that combines everything, because all of the original cast players are dead in the end. Heathcliff's dead, Kathy is the first is dead, her brother Hindley is dead, Edgar is dead, Isabel, his sister, is dead. All of them have died very young. And Heathcliff dies after seeing Kathy's ghost, which is why, if you look at this like a ghost story, he is haunted to death. And he wants to be haunted to death. But Nellie completes the arc. She lives through all of them. She lives to see what is good in Heathcliff, in how he raised Hareton, despite hating his father, that he did raise him, and that there is goodness still in Hareton. And Kathy, in what is good in Edgar, actually, coming through. The two of them came together and did fall in love, and are good friends, and are gentle with each other in a way that Heathcliff never was. And the very last page of the book, the last few paragraphs, is Lockwood seeing the culmination of this story. He sees the graves together. He sees Edgar and Heathcliff's graves on either side of Kathy's grave. Kathy's grave, which has been dug up twice, and all three of them lying together, and that they are in some way at peace, and the children are finally happy. But there's also something very interesting in the last line, because Nellie has now lived through these stories, lived to tell us about the harshness of these people together. And we've heard how Heathcliff wants to be haunted, how he doesn't believe that Kathy could possibly rest without him, and Edgar had kind of a traumatic ending and all of this. And he looks at these graves. This person who started off the story, who is our primary narrator, looks at the graves and says, "I lingered round them under that benign sky, watching the moths fluttering among the heath and harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass, and wondered how any one could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth." Which, if you've read through everything to the end, feels like, peaceful, but it should also feel like, ooh, unquiet slumbers, like, that's the whole point. They're not sleeping quietly. They never did sleep quietly. Kathy could not rest because Heathcliff did not want her to, because he constantly was digging up her grave. She eventually haunted him to death when he went into her old bedroom. Edgar might be lying peacefully, but he's surrounded by these two violent forces. And it's interesting because Mr. Lockwood is so far removed from everything that he's going to just leave this story behind, basically. And Nellie has told him what he considers to be a story. And I think maybe people think of it as a love story possibly because of the way Mr. Lockwood sort of dismisses it. To Nellie, it's not. And I think that's what's important, because she is the narrator of the story, of the plot, of the Kathy and Heathcliff debacle, and the Kathy and Hareton eventual retribution, I think is the right word for it, that they finally find their happiness together. She is the witness to all of that. And Mr. Lockwood is simply recalling the story back to us. What's fascinating about this story, though, also, I'm gonna go back to even crazier shit. So Emily Bronte wrote this story when she was very young. This is a very mature story, a lot of things going on. You don't often see the multiple narrative layers anymore. You don't often see this very obviously unreliable narrator, because not only are we getting a third-hand account of the story, Mr. Lockwood makes it very clear in the story that he is recalling a story that has been told to him while he was sick. So we're not even getting it like straight from Nellie's mouth or anything like that. We're getting a few days old story. And that is an interesting way to put layers of unreliability into a story. That's so cool. You also have just very unhappy people in the story. Emily Bronte died when she was 30. She saw her younger sister die. She saw her mother die. They moved to a place that's just plague-ridden. But so she was very young, and she does things with her story that Charlotte, who outlived her, does not do. One of those things, other than the unreliable narrators and the levels, is having these very real, very tortured characters. And it's not forced on them. It's a very natural torture to them, that they're torturing themselves, that they're tortured by their environment. Hindley, the older brother, is this sort of demonic force, which Nellie actually, I would argue Nellie loves Hindley, because she talks about him very gently, despite the fact that he hated Heathcliff to the point of beating him. And that when his wife died, who he did love, he became an alcoholic and a gambler, and eventually gambled his house away to Heathcliff. The alcoholic brother is a huge part of the story, that Heathcliff and the connivingness of all of his little plots and how they weave together. Kathy and her explosive, wild personality and her sheer evilness, pinning people against each other constantly needing to be the center of attention, to the point where letting herself die is the best way to spite people, and she does that. I mean, she is a mastermind. She is very scary, to the point it drives Heathcliff mad, and he becomes the evilness of Kathy, and it's brilliant. All of that tying together, but also having this entire second generation coming up and having to deal with the aftermath of this. And it's so beautifully tied together, especially the point that all of the remake movies miss, in that Kathy is not Kathy. First Kathy and second Kathy are completely different. First Kathy is a villain of the story, and second Kathy is not. Second Kathy is a victim of the story, and she pulls herself out of victimhood. She's really the heroine in the end. In Nellie's eyes, younger Kathy is the heroine. She saves Hareton. She, even in her worst times, can't help but be kind, where Kathy could not be kind. First Kathy could not do that. Just the writing of Wuthering Heights is brilliant. The line level writing is absolutely beautiful. I read you a couple selections from in there, and I just think it's stunning. I think someone so young had such a mastery of language, and that's why Wuthering Heights is still being taught today. There's so much going on in there. There's so much you can read into about singular characters, and yet I constantly have people say, oh, I didn't like it. It was a romance. Yeah, it wasn't a very good one. They're bad people. But that's the point. They are bad people. It's written so beautifully, and how they hurt each other is so interesting and so cruel and twisted. It's just a brilliant, brilliant story. And I have a problem with this, because I feel like If this were written by a man, we would read it the way it was intended to be read. When I read Great Gatsby for class, they really emphasize how these are bad people. This is a commentary on the time. If you read Wuthering Heights the same way, it is also a commentary on the time. People are dying of horrible things. People are horrible to each other. Life is not good. And here's the outcome, and here are the players, and this is what's happening. And it's also just a brilliant, brilliant ghost story, a brilliant haunting, and a brilliant, this is how bad people can be. But I think a lot of historical female writers get lumped into that category of romances. Jane Eyre is also very much kind of a coming of age, coming into yourself, highly feminist story. And it's often lumped into romance as well. There are elements of romance in the story, but it's not a romance story. Jane Austen, who does write romances, they are romantic stories, that is the plot, doesn't get enough credit for how funny she is. She is a brilliant satirist. Most of Jane Austen's work is intended to be funny. It is funny. It's social commentaries making fun of these different ways that people are meant to interact during this time period. Like, too much of historical fiction written by women, and too much fiction today written by women, is dismissed as being romance. It's okay for it to be romantic. It's okay for there to be romance. Pride and Prejudice is a very romantic story, but it does seem like we dismiss the brilliance within the works when it's written by a woman. And we're very willing to look for that when it's written by a man, even if it's not as brilliantly written. You'd be hard-pressed to find a story as carefully worded and as brilliantly tied together, with as great a language and as complex a plot as Wuthering Heights. This is truly a masterpiece. It is a horrific tragedy that there isn't more writing out there by Emily Bronte, that she didn't get to live longer to give us more works like Wuthering Heights. Because regardless of what you had to suffer through in high school or your teachers told you or anything like that, Wuthering Heights has earned a reputation for a reason. You need to go into reading it for the language and reading it for what's interesting about writing and what you can do with a story, because Wuthering Heights does things so well, does the unreliable narrator. You're gonna be hard pressed to find a more carefully written unreliable narrator. Sometimes you're gonna find one more obvious, but to have the 3 levels of narration and to have these stories about these people who we never meet, at no point within the writing of the story do we actually get introduced as a reader to Cathy Earnshaw. Never. And think about that. We are getting this third-hand account of her. Always. Many of the other characters, Heathcliff included, we get 2 different perspectives of. We get Mr. Lockwood's and we get Nellie's, but we never get anything but how Nellie describes Cathy. Ever. We don't get to see her actions for ourselves. We don't get to see Mr. Linton's actions for ourselves. There are many characters who we only have this other account of them. And still the language is so perfectly chosen. Still the lines are just unbelievable. And the characters are interesting. There isn't a single character who you can't pick out and find more and more layers to. They're so complex. Even the side characters, even Hindley's wife is interesting. Leaves behind a child. That child grows up to be a major player in the second half of the story. And so I feel very passionate about this. I feel like Wuthering Heights is often given a dismissal, and I think that 10 times out of 10, people who don't like Wuthering Heights either did not read it or were told to read it as a romance and found it boring. And I would challenge you to pick it back up again and give it another shot. Read it as a story. Read it as a commentary on life during this era. Read it as a ghost story. Read it as an exploration in how terrible people can be to each other and how that can affect others. Maybe I'm a little twisted. Maybe I'm a little dark for thinking that this is so brilliant, but if anyone ever asks me who my favorite author is, it is Emily Bronte. My favorite book is this book. I have read it every few years since 5th grade when I first read it. I first, sat down with a dictionary and read the book, and it took me a long time, and I loved it. And I read it because I saw the 1992 movie version, which was very romantic and very cute. And that wasn't the story that it ended up being. It ended up being very different, and every time I read through it I find new things that are interesting and amazing and new lines that I'm just floored by. I really wanted to come and share because I'm so passionate about Wuthering Heights, and I am willing to fight anybody about it because I believe that this is one of the greatest novels ever written. So let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if you've ever read Wuthering Heights, if you hated it, if you've loved it, if you think I missed anything that was super important about Wuthering Heights. Let me know in the comments. Give this video a like, subscribe, and thank you for watching.